where conversation explores the art of thinking beyond the obvious. And today I have my special guest. He's an international best-selling author, public speaker, and endurance athlete whose mission is a form of more meaningful human connections through storytelling. No other than Mr. David Richards.
Daniel, how are you? It's good to see you.
Good to see you again, Mr. David. I'm fabulous, fabulous, and thank you so much for being part on Abstract Essay. And can you please introduce more about yourself?
Sure. So I'm a Marine Corps veteran. I'm a yoga instructor. I did 17 years in corporate, and now I am an executive coach as well as an international best-selling author.
Congratulations, and looking forward for more best-selling books, Mr. David. And today, let's talk about your. Is it your favorite character in the Bible, King David?
I think that's a good question. I don't know if he's my favorite. I feel like he's the most intriguing besides Jesus. And I
Yes.
say that because his story, I believe, is severely misunderstood. And
Miss.
what I mean by that is, so if you know his story, most people probably think of him. He's a king and he kills Goliath, but he had kind of a dark side too. And he slept with someone's wife. He had her husband killed, and he did this after a promise had been made to him that his offspring would establish an everlasting kingdom and David's eternal throne. And that offspring obviously is Jesus. So what I've kind of looked at as my studies of the Bible have deepened is, how can David be a part of the kingdom that Jesus is establishing? Like that is a conscious journey. And I think for many people, they think, well, David was a man after God's own heart, so he died and he goes to heaven. But the Bible says David doesn't go to heaven. It says in Acts 2:34 that he doesn't ascend to heaven. So in my work, certainly in my two books ago, Love Letters to the Virgin Mary, I look at that from a very kind of visceral, personal, or intimate standpoint, a first person standpoint. And then in my most recent book, Becoming One with Christ, The Lessons of King David, I take a more objective view of that story, which is in some ways my argument, Daniel, is that David's story is the story of humanity, and humanity's quest for salvation can be found through the story of King David.
Mr. David, when Samuel saw a new king, God told him to judge by appearance because the Lord's look at the heart. How
Right.
does this distinction between outward appearances or appearance and inner character speak to our true identity?
That's such a great question. For me, it ties into Jesus's two commandments. So, what does Jesus say? He says, when he's asked what is the greatest commandment, he says, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. So, that's an internal sense of love, right? There's an internal sense because of this feeling of within. And then the second commandment that he says is to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, if you have this internal sense of love of God for yourself, and then you appreciate that your neighbor has it as well, then you're really loving from a place of the heart. And what's interesting is, obviously, when Jesus was asked that question about which is the greatest commandment, I don't know if the questioner was thinking that he was going to draw from the 10 commandments. But if you look at his two commandments, the first four of the 10 commandments given to Moses are about relationship with God. And so Jesus answers that with his first commandment, love the Lord your God. And then the last six are about a relationship with other people. And Jesus takes care of those six with his second commandment. So in some sense, it's really about stepping outside of the church. And what I mean by that is, when Jesus, there are 45,000 denominations of Christianity in the world today.
Yes.
None of those existed when Jesus was alive. And so Jesus was saying, not only did he say, love your enemies, pray for those people who persecute you, but he's also talking about this idea that when you recognize the divine in you, you automatically recognize it in someone else too, regardless of what their backstory is, regardless of their culture, regardless of their ethnicity. None of that matters if you can get outside the confines of religion.
Interesting. Mr. David, Acts 13 describes David as a man after my heart, who will do all my will. In your view, what qualities made David fit this description, and how can we cultivate a similar heart orientation?
Yeah. So David, even though David faltered, right? So he's possessed by the Spirit of the Lord after the Spirit leaves Saul. Um, and he writes all these really kind of cryptic psalms when you look at it, because most of the psalms he writes about are about being saved from the pit. Obviously Psalm 23, walking through the valley of the shadow. He also prophesies Christ's death by crucifixion, and he prophesies resurrection in Psalm 71:20. And so this idea is that there is, even though he breaks the promise made to him of the everlasting kingdom, there is an incredible faith and loyalty. And he knows, even on his deathbed, when he's comforted by a virgin, he knows that that God is with him still. So it's really about, again, you said it earlier, about turning away from the outward appearance and seeking God within you.
Seeking God within you. So tell us, Mr. David, what is your latest book?
Yeah, so my latest book, which just came out at the end of May, is called Becoming One with Christ: The Lessons of King David. And so what I did was I looked at, what does Jesus teach about, if we look at kind of a pinnacle. Oh, you have to, oh, maybe it didn't go. Shoot. Oh, I thought I gave you the specific. So if you, oh, maybe you can't see it. Hold on 1 second. Let me send you the Amazon link.
Go ahead.
Here we go.
While you're doing that, just tell us about what is all about.
Yeah, so it's really about a deeper look at the promise made to David of an everlasting kingdom and an eternal throne, when you realize that he's also not going to, or he doesn't ascend to heaven. So it looks at the consequences of, if David doesn't ascend to heaven, one, I would argue that David is the anchor point for Christ's return, because if you read the Bible story in its entirety, there's been a belief, certainly in the West, in the United States in particular, over the last couple of hundred years, that we die and we escape this world and we go to heaven. And if you read the Bible ends with God coming to earth. So, and it's been fascinating for me as I've kind of deepened my research, because I've heard Christians say, well, I don't believe that. Like, you don't believe the source material from which your faith originates, that's how the Bible ends. And so I looked at it, one, if David doesn't ascend, then he's the anchor point for Christ's return, because you have to think about it from the standpoint of, if he's promised an everlasting kingdom and an eternal throne, what would David have to believe about Jesus? Right? Because and so you can kind of go through the Bible story, not just from the Old Testament. And there are three or four references to, there's Jeremiah 39, there's Ezekiel 34 and Ezekiel 37, where there are references to David being raised up. And then you go into the New Testament and there are 18 references to Jesus as the son of David. And then you get to the end of the Bible and Jesus says, I am the root and the offspring of David. And so in one sense, if he's the son of David, but he's also David's origin, then isn't that true for all humanity? And there's a great verse in Isaiah 55:3 where the Lord says the promise made to David is available to everyone. So that's why, again, I say kind of the book is the pathway for, one, David's story as the archetype for humanity's salvation. Two, it takes a really close look at some of the more intense Bible verses that, quite frankly, don't get discussed a lot in modern churches. And it's John 14:23. Those who love me will obey my teachings. My Father will love them. We will come make our home in them. Meaning the Father and Jesus are going to inhabit a follower. And what does that mean? And if the Spirit of truth is within us, that's all elements of the Trinity exists within us, is basically what Jesus is saying, what Paul's saying in the letter to the Romans. And it's also, what does it really mean to pick up your cross and follow Christ? A lot of times this gets talked about in a Sunday sermon, but what does that actually mean to do that? And and through my own journey, as I've done that, I realize that's what strips away all the denominations, all the church dogma and constraints, because you realize none of that was there when Jesus was around. And if you can appreciate that we're all one, Jesus talks about complete unity, and I forget the Bible verse, but he talks about, that he and the Father are one, and he wants the Father to see that Jesus is one with all his followers, all the people. And there's also this idea that Jesus has accounted for everyone that his Father gave him. And so there has to be some real reconciliation. I would also say the book is ultimately about what does it mean to walk that path, and then come to realize that Christ is responsible for it all.
Mr. David, becoming one with Christ, if you will connect to King David, what is the connection?
So the connection is that, if I understand your question,
Yes. What would be the connection?
Yeah, so Jesus is David's offspring. That is repeatedly mentioned throughout the Bible. So there must be some sort of reconciliation between Jesus and David for the establishment of heaven on earth and for the everlasting kingdom. That's the connection between the two.
Although Samuel anointed David years past before he became a king, how does this waiting period reveal hidden truth about God's timing, patience, and identity formation?
Well, I think if you believe in the idea that everything happens for a reason, then when God's anointing came over David, he waited until the right moment to anoint David as king and to make David king. At the same time, you look then very intentionally that even though the Lord's spirit had settled on David, he still fell. And I think that's a huge point of the Bible. Even though you can be anointed, you can still fall. And quite frankly, that speaks to the idea then that Jesus must somehow account for David's salvation. Like there must be a conscious relationship between the two, because again, it doesn't make sense that David would go into heaven if Jesus is the one responsible for establishing the kingdom that is going to ultimately result in heaven on earth.
Mr. David, if you compare King David to Joseph the Dreamer, what is the big difference?
I mean, David is Israel's king, and David is responsible for turning his house against him. And what's interesting, if you look back, there's this idea of federal representation, and it's deep in Christianity. I don't know that the ancient Jews practiced or thought about it so much, but it was the idea that one person embodies the entire group. And obviously that's kind of what Jesus is. The Messiah is the salvation of all. And there's a great book by David Bentley Hart called That All Shall Be Saved. And in the book, he asks, if God is omnipotent, how could God create a soul that wouldn't be saved? Like God would not create a soul that he knows is destined for eternal suffering, because that would be a really cruel God. So David is, because he divides his house and he writes about being in the pit, you can make the connection that Jesus and David, when Jesus dies and descends into the pits, David is at the bottom of the pit because of the Davidic covenant between the two of them. And I would say that's probably the big difference between David and Joseph the Dreamer.
David was an accomplished musician and composed many psalms. How do music and poetry provide a window into his inner life, and what role can creative expression play in our spiritual identity?
That's a great question. Oftentimes, there's a beautiful contrast in David, right? In some sense,
Yes.
he's this powerful warrior who's killed tens of thousands of people. He's a great king, and yet he's also a musician and a poet. And he writes this, he has this really arguably softer side to him that is uncommon, we might say, in that time and period. And it speaks to, there's a great book called The Alphabet versus the Goddess, and it talks about in particular how when they discovered the pre-Hebrew language on Mount Sinai that became what the Hebrews used, it marked a big shift where there used to be like the hieroglyphs of Egypt and other ancient societies were much more feminine dominant. And then when the alphabet came in, there was this shift because the left hemisphere of the brain is where logic and reason exist, and the alphabet spoke to that. And so then we saw this erosion of female deities and female prevalence in society, and male patriarchy started to rise up. I think when you look at David's Psalms and his musical background, that there is a nice balance between his masculine and feminine energy. Like we all have masculine and feminine energy. We all come from a mother and a father. And there's a nice harmony in there. And when you realize that to be whole, you have to acknowledge all parts of yourself. And that's kind of a Carl Jung, the famed depth psychologist from Europe. Carl Jung had this idea that there's ourself, the higher integrated version of ourself. There's a shadow that we often repress and project onto other people. There's the persona, the social mask that we wear. But then men have an anima and women have an animus. And that's the feminine aspect of a man or the male aspect of a woman. It has nothing to do with sexuality, but it's the realization that for you to become whole, you have to integrate that. And I think in some sense, when you look at David's background, you start to see that feminine aspect was already within him based on his, not only his musical background, his poetry, and then you contrast that with the strong masculine who was the king, who was this famous warrior.
Mr. David, becoming one with Christ, what are your expectations?
We live in a fascinating time in the world. And 5 years ago, we all experienced something extraordinary with the pandemic that shut down the world. My journey of faith really began with that pandemic. It was obviously a lifelong process, but it came into real focus during the pandemic. And I believe we're living at the greatest time in history. You can certainly look at the outside world and see that things are in a unusual or unique state. And yet that's only a revelation that you need to cultivate that spirit within you. And that's, you think about Christ overcoming the world in the day of social media and everything else, you have to overcome it too. So my goal is to continue to promote this book because I believe this book is going to lay the foundation for a huge shift in our species, quite frankly.
What are your struggles in writing Becoming One with Christ?
That's another great question. I actually wrote 2 books between, so my last book that I published in December of 2022, Love Letters to the Virgin Mary, I wrote a sequel to that in 2023, and I wrote about 300 pages, and then I realized that was more for me kind of doing the Jungian integration of my psyche. And for men out there, the anima, the Latin origin of anima is the soul. So if you think the feminine aspect of you is your soul, and Carl Jung believed that that was a pathway to the subconscious mind and to kind of deeper understanding. So then I set that book aside, and then I started working on another book, and that was about how heaven and earth would come together. If that's how the Bible ends, how does that happen in the 21st century? I finished that book in early 2024, and then I've been working with a coach, like a results coach from Tony Robbins, for people who are familiar with Tony Robbins. And we've been working together for about 2.5 years. And I got into May of 2024 and something just didn't feel right. And so I kind of sat back and I said, well, what is the greatest test of faith? Like when you get right down to it, what is the greatest test of faith that I could comprehend? And for me, it was, has Jesus conquered death? That is the basis of the Christian story. It's not the 10 Commandments. It's not Noah. It's not Jonah and the whale. It's not King David. It's, did Jesus die and resurrect? And I thought, well, if that's really the ultimate test of faith, then I need to explain and explore the relationship between King David and Jesus, because there's a covenant made to David for an everlasting kingdom and an eternal throne, and it depends on his relationship with Jesus. Jesus has to establish the kingdom, and I would argue that David has to believe that Jesus has established the kingdom, and that has to be a conscious act by David, which again just said to me cements the idea that David can't be in heaven if Jesus is responsible for the kingdom. So this book is a look at the biblical history. It looks at what happens to Western civilization after the resurrection and how the advance of Christianity shaped Western civilization to a great deal. And then it also gets into neuroscience, like how we change our nervous system through the power of incantations. It looks at quantum physics and the idea that is much more popular and acceptable today, that there might be multiple universes out there, because if heaven's around and Jesus is accounted for everyone, and that's kind of the contention that I put into the book as well, that between David and Jesus, all of humanity is accounted for, then heaven would have to be huge, because there have been more than 100 billion people who've ever lived. And then finally, the last part of the book is a personal exploration of what does it mean to pick up your cross and follow Jesus? What does it mean to look at some of his teachings and take them to heart? And how do you cultivate the physical faith within you to transform into what I believe is the necessary path towards climbing Jacob's ladder?
Mr. David, before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please to listen to my other podcast, people. My other podcast, because my abstract essay is already in 5th season, abstract poetry in 2nd season, and my book 101 review in 5th season too. Comedy 101 in 2nd season, and my food 101 in 5th season as well. Geography 101 in 4th season, and my baby podcast Law 101 and Mental Health 101. Love letters in 3rd season, and movie 101 review and music 101 in 4th season, and Science 101 and Sex 101 in its 1st season. Please listen to them wherever you listen to your podcast. So finally, Mr. David, what practical steps or discipline do you recommend for readers seeking awaken to their divine identity using lessons from King David's life?
What a great question, Daniel. And thank you so much for having me on. Congratulations to all the success you've had with your podcasts.
Thank you so much.
A couple things. One is, if you don't have a journaling practice, grab a pen and paper and start journaling. I found for me, journaling has transformed my life. It's transformed my writing. It's also a way for you to connect with yourself, to develop a relationship with yourself. And if you don't think you need to, that's a good reason to start journaling, because there's absolutely a relationship there. The other thing that I've done is incantations. And incantations are, people may be familiar with affirmations like I am genius, or I am smart, or I am beautiful. The difference between affirmations and incantations is emotion. And the more emotion you put into it, the more that actually changes your nervous system. And so what I've done, to me, this is one of my greatest contributions, hopefully, is I've looked at Jesus's I am statements, because we know that I am is the basis of identity. And I said, well, if I want to awaken Christ within me, if the spirit of truth is what Paul says lives within all of us, and we all have that resurrection power within us, then I want to awaken that spirit within me. And so I have started incanting, I am the way, the truth, and the life, to bring that Christ consciousness to wake within me. And that kind of connects with Corinthians 2:16, where Paul says we all share the mind of Christ. So incantations, really looking at Jesus's teachings and putting those above the other teachings, because the entire Old Testament is meant to set up Jesus. All the covenants that are made between Noah, between Moses, between David, they're all between Abraham. They're all meant to set up Jesus, because only Jesus fulfills all the covenants. And then you look at, well, what does he say about complete unity? What does he say? What do his I am statements really mean? And what is his relationship to David, and how does it apply to all of us? And to me, if David's story is the pathway through the Bible story towards salvation, then that's a pathway that we should all look to embody, from his downfall in the Old Testament to all the discussions about Jesus as the son of David in the New Testament.
Definitely. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world, Mr. David. Hoping for more and more empowering books like this to come. So can you please invite our listeners to support all your books?
Yes, please. They're all available on Amazon now. I'm in the process of updating my website once I can find out my domain host information. But please check them out. And Daniel, thank you so much for having me on.
You're most welcome. And please do come over on Book 101 Review and let's talk about becoming one with Christ.
I would love that. Thank you.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. David, because if you support him, for sure, more and more best-selling books to come. So, Mr. David, thank you so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure, Daniel. Thank you.
More to come, people. See you soon.